Today, we are thrilled to welcome James Perry. Jim is an internationally recognized expert in public administration. He's a former editor of the Public Administration Review, which is one of the foremost journals in public administration. He is the Distinguished and Chancellor's Professor Emeritus at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Jim is responsible for 10 books, 150 articles in the areas of public administration, including issues such as governance, civil service reform, and public service motivation. His most recent book is one near and dear to my heart. It's on managing organizations, but it specifically focuses on these questions of how can we tap into people's intrinsic motivations to enhance public service delivery. It's a real important counterweight to dominant policy narratives that focus on things like pay for performance, extrinsic incentives, monitoring and punishing civil servants, by instead tapping into the things that are already inside civil servants. So I am delighted to have Jim come and share some of the wisdom he has from his career looking at public service motivation and helping us think through how this can intersect with really important questions of development. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. This has been a long time coming because I think we started this conversation in fall 2019, and then we were struck with a pandemic, and that delayed us last year. And I was hoping to make an in-person visit, but that's not possible still. But I'm pleased to be accessible and engaged virtually. The title of the presentation is one that I think I came up with over a year ago, and I might have modified it a little bit, made it more pithy, but Public Service Motivation, Origins, Development, and Future Research. Let me, if I can, the mouse works, okay. Let me give you a preview of what I want to talk about, and I will probably move quickly because we have about 30 minutes. And I see we have one of our colleagues, Kim Mickelson, who's one of the contributors to this research. And I'm happy to see Kim, and I cite one of the papers later in the presentation. But Kim, welcome, and thanks for joining us. First of all, I want to talk about definitions, theory, and evolution of the research. The fact is that in the public administration community, people would be quite familiar with this, but as we sort of move outside into other fields, the awareness of what we've been doing for the last 30 plus years is not quite as obvious and quite as clear. Then one of the questions that Professor McDonald said I should touch on, and then I want to touch on briefly, is what does public service motivation matter? She already articulated sort of one of the logics and what brought me to this research, and that was that from the late 1970s until the early 1990s, I studied extrinsic rewards, which were sort of a key part of governmental reform in the US and across the OECD countries. But the reality is that the reforms, particularly with respect to public motivation, the motivation of public servants, didn't work very well. And so I embarked upon this research in 1990 for that very reason. I also want, since the Kellogg focuses on international studies and international development, to focus on selective research results with attention to developing countries. I probably understate the amount of research there, and I may also overstate the consistency across the results, but that's something else that I want to touch on. Then I want to sort of very briefly talk about future research, and if I can move through the presentation quickly enough. Okay, first, let me go to the definitions. Public service motivation started in 1990 with a very precise definition, one that I've not strayed from significantly. All of the language could have been slightly improved in retrospect, but Lois Wise and I, in an article that was published in the 50th anniversary issue of Public Administration Review, termed public service motivation in individuals' predisposition to respond to motives that are grounded primarily or uniquely in public institutions and organizations. We tried very specifically to set aside the types of incentives that would appeal to people who are pursuing public service and work in public organizations, government organizations, although the concept itself is one that's individually based. So it's not public sector motivation, it's public service motivation. That is, to what extent are is effort and the motivation and energies of an individual captured by incentives that might be primarily or uniquely public. And that certainly in the scheme of things doesn't include pay, for instance, which we understand not to be sort of a primary motivation of people coming to public service. Now, when I started that research, there were other concepts that were of interest to me, but I found them to be essentially empty in the literature and inaccessible to the use in my research on public service motivation. For instance, altruism, which is motivation based on the considerations of another's needs rather than one's own. This is basically saying, I'm not thinking about myself, I'm thinking about others. Was also another consideration when I started this research. But I certainly was not so idealistic that I believed that public service motivation was primarily altruistic in nature, that it was much broader than that. But I think altruism was certainly a part of it because I did know people who entered public service and were interested in public service whose motives were primarily altruistic in character. And then another concept that is relevant here is pro-social motivation. This I sort of consider to be broader than public service motivation, but it's a desire to have a positive impact on other people, groups, and organizations. And certainly some people have translated the idea of public service motivation to motivation that was public regarding and focused on one's community or public service, although I don't define public service motivation that narrowly, but I do think about pro-social motivation about being broader. That is, thinking about other people may not necessarily have the same object of one's motivation as individuals associated with government or quasi-government organizations. So those are definitions, and and the literature, for instance, I summarize and synthesize in the book, which Professor McDonald pointed out focuses across all those domains: public service motivation, altruism, and pro-social motivation. Although clearly the lion's share of research that I focus on comes from the literature on public service motivation. These definitions, what's important for me is to say that the concepts converge around their emphasis on other orientation. For instance, altruism is sort of the classic notion that we associated with interest in the other or motivation to do good for the others rather than for ourselves. And clearly there's a distinct separation between the other orientation and sort of the self-interest focus that preceded it in the prior research that I had been engaged before I started down this line of research on public service motivation. It's represented by notions of self-sacrifice, altruism, and pro-social behavior. So the other orientation, I think, is sort of the commonality here across all these streams of research. Now, the research on public service motivation has not evolved overnight. It's really sort of a 30-year investment, certainly not only on my part, but on the part of a variety of others. In a 2014 article that appeared in the Asia Pacific Journal of Public Administration, I referred to 3 or 4 different ways. One was the definition and measurement that took place largely from 1990 to 1999. Then we had a period where the sort of the nomological network and the measures were validated and diffused, 2000, 2010, followed by trying to fill in gaps, and there were many gaps, and there still are gaps. Finally, the fourth wave, which I refer to as applying research results, and certainly that book on managing organizations to sustain passion for public service is all about the many ways in which we can energize people and direct people's activities surrounding the use of these devices, these other-oriented devices, to generate motivation and direction in public service. But I think the research has matured to the point where we can now talk about how do we apply this research? And that's certainly of interest to me as I sort of move deeper and deeper into retirement and further away from the 1990 origins of generating this concept and the research behind it. So let me sort of touch on first theory foundations. If one looks back at the 1990 article, you'll find relatively little reference to theory. There was some reference to the job design literature at the time, and a few other lines of research. One of the lines of research we engaged in there, or we discussed and used as the core of the original theory, was something called predisposition opportunity theory that David Noak and Christine Wright-Isaac featured in a 1982 article in a sociology journal, an annual review of sociology. So we started with the predisposition opportunity theory, but that also is attached to other research that was forthcoming subsequent to the original article, or about the same time, attraction, selection, attrition theory, or ASA theory, which is largely out of psychology and social psychology. Similarly, person environment fit theory. All three of those theories were about the fit between the individual and the individual's motives and what incentives appeal to those motives in a public context. Self-determination theory is also relevant here, and self-determination theory has become a major enterprise. But one of the arguments in self-determination theory is that motivation ranges from external and extrinsic to internal or intrinsic, and there's a gradient. And the more we move toward intrinsic motivation, the stronger and more compelling are the motivations, because they reside with the individual rather than being controlled by some extrinsic entity, external entity. Motivation crowding theory comes from economists, but it's basically theory that's grounded in the psychological arguments of self-determination theory. So it's an economics of psychology, or psychological economics. And then the third sort of general major stream is goal theory, which suggests that goals, based on the extent to which the individual is committed to those goals and to the extent to which they're challenging, will influence the motivation of individuals. So all of those are, I would say, are very strong theoretical foundations underpinning this research on public service motivation theory. Oops. Now, there are two scales, and I just want to bring these to your attention. One that I created in 1996, that's basically based on my thinking about public service motivation given American institutions in the American context and my American experiences. I got pushback on that over time from colleagues in Belgium and Netherlands and China and Korea and elsewhere, basically arguing that, well, we don't think about public values in the same way as you do in the US. Therefore, we need to have a richer or broader dimensionality for public values in measuring what public service motivation is. So this second scale I point to, you'll see my name there appearing about number 12 on the list. I've never written an article with 16 authors before. This is sort of takes credit for, if I've written 150 articles, this has almost as many articles as all the other articles combined. But this was 16 contributors from Italy and Denmark and Korea and China and elsewhere. We had so many authors on there that one of the authors died in the process between developing the scale and publishing it. Not that it took us that long, but this is probably not a statistical surprise, given if you have enough people that somebody is not going to make it through the process. But that is often referred to as the international scale for public service motivation. Now, those scales, the Perry 1996 and the Kim et al. 2013, are very similar. They have this attraction to public policy making, which is what I call it my scale. Kim et al. Scale is called public participation. There's also, in my scale, a commitment to the public interest or civic duty. That has the broader description of commitment to public values in the Kim et al. Scale. Two of the dimensions, compassion and self-sacrifice, pan out in the international scale just as they do in the American scale. So there's a high degree of commonality cross-nationally. Although I should say, as people test these scales in different countries, it gets tweaked. For instance, I got an email from a scholar in Portugal in the last 10 days that says that there's a fair degree of consistency, but they also found two new dimensions that tend to be the obverse or the reverse of some of the scales. Like there's a self-sacrifice, but then there's also a diametrically opposed scale. I don't know how valid the Portuguese scale is, but it suggests that there's, again, commonalities, but there may also be differences. And in part, that makes sense given the institutional variability across different countries. Now, for what does public service motivation make a difference? In my book, in the first chapter, I sort of point to all the dimensionality or all the outcome variables and all the variables to which public service motivation might either be an antecedent or a determinant. It includes job choice decisions, whether one goes to work for a public organization or a private, incentives, work design and performance, performance itself, ethical behavior, innovative behavior. Other people have done research on collaborative behavior. So we have a large body of studies, something like 300 to 500, and I've sort of lost track of how many we have. The most recent systematic review says over 300, most of them done since the year 2000. But that number keeps growing monthly or weekly. But the reality is we have lots of variables and lots of variables that have been used in the study of public service motivation. So for what does it matter? It matters for a lot, at least as in terms of the scholarship on public service motivation. Now I want to talk about some universals in sort of the time left to me. And I'm going to focus on four: performance, meritocratic institutional arrangements, incentives, and ethical behavior. And ethical behavior could also include corruption, but I'm not. I'm trying to be a little bit conservative in how I label that particular dimension. But by universals, I mean we have research not only in the Western world, but in developing countries that tend to support some of the relationships that have been found in the West. Let me go first to the performance dimension. And here there are a couple of mechanisms, and on all these slides, I don't touch on the mechanisms, but on this one I do, as I do through two of the next three. The mechanisms linking public service motivation to performance. One is the concept of what I call organizational identification. This is the extent to which the individual connects with the work that's being done by the organization. In the larger literature, this often manifests itself as mission. Now, there's also literature, for instance, in the goal theory along the lines of goal theory, which talk about goal valence or the mission valence for the individuals. And so organizational identification, this tends to be, to what extent does the individual or identify with the work that's being done by the organization, not saying anything necessarily about the nature of the characteristics of the individual. There's also research, certainly some of it more aligned with the self-determination literature, that talks about internalization or identification as a psychological property of the individual. And to the extent that the individual owns the goals or owns the mission of the organization, that internalizes it and is distinct from this literature on organizational identification. But I think both of these are major factors in explaining why there's a relationship between what we refer to as public service motivation and performance. There is a meta-analysis by Warren and Chin that was done in 2013, which included about 40 to 50 studies. This was what I would call a meta-analysis light. It suggests the percentage effects influenced by public service motivation. The numbers are relatively small. I think understates the influence of public service motivation on performance, but that cuts across countries, and so is multi-country in its purview. Then there are also some high-quality studies in the West, Italy and Denmark. For instance, Nico Bella, a colleague at the time he was at University of Bocconi University, did a field experiment with nurses at a public hospital and suggests that public service motivation and performance are strongly linked. Lotte Andersen and her colleagues at Aarhus University in Denmark studied the relationship between public service motivation and student marks. And the higher the public service motivation of the teachers, the better the marks for the students. So they're in those high quality and experimental and longitudinal studies, we identify sort of a link between public service motivation and performance. But there's also research in Pakistan by Callan and colleagues that points to public service motivation predicting doctor and to some extent a lesser influence on inspector performance. There's also research in China by Miao, Ava, Newman, and Schwartz that says public service motivation results in higher levels of organizational identification and higher performance. There's also another study that I don't have on the slide here that I think is, I'm going to my notes here, which I may get to. And that other study is by Dyson Ross in 2015. It's in Uganda, Ghana, and Kenya, and suggests that there's a relationship. One of the interesting things about a lot of this international research, and I sort of just point this out as I move through these slides, a lot of it is related to public health issues. And so one of the issues I think we need to investigate going forward is do the results from this research hold up for non-health organizations? And I have to sort of profess some admiration for the fact that the public health people have spent so much time looking at some of this stuff, and it may testify to the research community in that area. But I think we need to think about it in other areas, whether it's education, policing, or other standard public service. But I think we have a fairly strong and we'll say universal relationship between performance and public service motivation. Although there's, one of the other sources I consulted is a piece from the Personnel Economics of the Developing State, which is the Handbook of Economic Field Experiments, 2017, by Feenan, Olkin, and Pondy. And they suggest that there's a large public administration research, and they point to that as, again, evidence for the sort of relationship between public service motivation and performance. So economists, too, are sort of pointing to some of this research as being suggesting that there's a difference with regard to the sort of the motivational characteristics in organizational performance. Now, another area where I sort of cite less research is the research coming out of the University of Gothenburg's Quality of Government Institute, which is substantial. Dahlstrom and LaPuente did a book on organizing Leviathan before the patchwork Leviathan, that Professor McDonald's book came along, but they both recognize this Leviathan. But the reality is that what they've compared 100 countries on a variety of measures, pointing to measures of efficiency, effectiveness, non-corruption, impartiality. And their theory is that merit systems, where we have systems where politicians are responsible to a different set of incentives than bureaucrats, and where they have in effect autonomous systems governing the rules for their behavior, tend to be associated with high quality outputs from governments. And so I point to this generic literature on meritocratic institutional arrangements. Now, I think there are some questions about what is a meritocratic system that we need to delve into further, and certainly is aligned for future research. That is, when is a merit system, or when does it become excessive in certain ways? For instance, one of the ways we've historically pointed to is that job security may become too ironclad and therefore prevent bureaucrats from being responsible and responsive to their political masters, and that could be a problem. So we need to sort of identify the boundaries of what is a good merit system from one that is less good. But clearly, meritocratic institutional arrangements are important devices. Now,
Jim, I want to just break into nudge. It looks like you have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left, and by my count, you have a few slides left.
I will move through quickly. But the two areas were, and I point this out in chapter 5 of the book, one of the results of meritocratic institutional arrangements is the creation of common pool resources. That is, bureaucracies that protect the missions and protect the tasks that the bureaucrats are doing. And that is a salutary result, which I think supports public service motivation. The other very direct influence is on promoting basic psychological needs, the needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which is one of the principal needs identified in self-determination theory. But so one of the questions is, well, why is it that meritocratic institutional arrangements make a difference? They make a difference because they provide a supportive work environment that generates cooperative activity, common pool resources, and also assures the pursuit of the basic psychological needs of bureaucrats. Now, 2 other areas here, and very quickly, incentives. One of the divides, the economists make a distinction between high-powered incentives and low-powered incentives. All of my research suggests that low-powered incentives is the way to go. We need to sort of pursue low-powered incentives in contexts where pro-social motivation is important, because high-powered incentives tend to reduce pro-social motivation, and they also increase the problems of multitasking. One of the interesting studies here is this study by Kahn in 2021 that starkly shows the influence of multitasking problems in the demise of pro-social motivation in Pakistan. And so there are several studies, Indonesia, Uganda, Pakistan, and Malawi, all which point to the importance of low-powered incentives being preferred to high-powered incentives. Finally, ethical behavior. This is the Meyer-Solly, Mickelson, and Schuster study on 5,000 Chilean central government officials that used a survey experiment and suggest that public service motivation enhances willingness to report ethical problems. There's also a very interesting study out in 2019 by Olson and colleagues in the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory that suggests that public service motivation is negatively related to dishonest activity in the dice game, which has become sort of one of the methods for assessing corruption and dishonesty or unethical behavior. Gans Morse also points out that even in Russia, high public service motivation individuals are inclined to prefer going to government and will move there after graduation. And so even though we tend sometimes to have unexplainable movement of people to government to engage in corrupt acts, Gans Morse's direct measure of public service motivation indicates that those are the individuals who are counter much of the rest of the research going into government in Russia. Now, in chapter 9 of my book, I talk about 3 areas for future research. I think if we want to apply this research, we need to do more field experiments. And I think systematic programs of field experiments, which are becoming more common, is the way to go. And we certainly see some of this carried over into the behavioral economics, behavioral analysis groups that have started in the UK and moved to the US, and now I think are evident in about 100 countries globally. We also need to do more research that bridges the micro to the macro. We may know, for instance, that individual responses or individuals who are high public service motivated give us better results. The question is, at a macro level, what sort of indicators do we have of that? And then there's also a concern of some people that public service motivation may have its dark side. To me, I'm not all that concerned. We have to accept the dark side with the good side. The reality is, though, we can mitigate the dark side. For instance, some research suggests that high public service motivation people may also be those most likely to burn out in their work. Well, we need to find ways of avoiding burnout if we want to keep those people on the job. And so if burnout is the dark side, we need to find ways of mitigating. Now, if you're interested in finding more research about this, I maintain a fairly comprehensive bibliography at this website, https://psm.indiana.edu, which is on my page at the O'Neill School. But if you want to look at, and there's also a downloadable Word document or Word file there with about 500 citations in it. So you can search on pro-social motivation and a variety of other things that if you want to sort of investigate this research more substantially. And that's it. Only 4 minutes over.
Thanks so much, Jim. I appreciate that. Thanks to everybody. I'm going to lead off with a question that we received in advance that I'm also going to kind of put a spin on, which is from Jumin Yang, a high school student who's applying to Notre Dame. We had a question about what is the most common motivation in public service, and would that motivation change, enhance, or weaken? And so one of the things I kind of want to leverage that back to you with is, to what extent do we understand public service motivation to be a durable individual characteristic or something that changes over time? Either because the whole basket of the different 4 components goes up and down, or might I, increase in one component and decrease in others over the course of my service as a public servant? What do we know about that?
Well, we've got a number of studies, although it's sort of hard to summarize, particularly given the sort of the scope of the question. This question is asking, what do we know about sort of all the motivations of public servants? And that's, we don't have great data, although I think if you look at the World Values Survey or the International Social Survey, you can pick up information on that from international sources and cross-nationally. The purpose of my book, for instance, was to say that that people come to government often and quasi-government organizations because of their interest in doing good, to helping other people, because of their interest in public service. And to the extent that we can magnify the importance of public service in those contexts, one is we're going to get more people coming to government for public service. And I think we do have systematic evidence that suggests that people are more pro-social or more public service motivated who come to government. Right. And so we know that. But we need also to spend time using that characteristic of those individuals to make a difference once they get there. For instance, we have research that suggests that the motivations of people, public service motivation of people, may decline over time, in part because supervisors and others ignore the public service motivation that people bring to their jobs. And so we need to reinforce that over time, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to use that as a way to keep those individuals engaged and up the game. And so we also, I also argue in other outlets, and one is a 2017 article in Public Administration Review, that public service motivation is malleable. It changes over time. It doesn't change minute by minute. But to the extent, for instance, one of the arguments I make in the book is that, we're going to get people coming to government who are not all that interested in public service. but it may be that they're doing important work for people and for the body politic. Well, I think we want them to know that. We want them to appreciate that. And we might want to grow that, because that might, in addition to their technical competence, might endear them more closely to the missions of the organization. And so through mentorship and through onboarding and other ways of socializing people, we want to grow public service motivation. And it's important, I think, that we understand that, because as you point out in your research, for instance, we have these pockets, these niches of bureaucratic activity in developing countries, in failed states, in countries that do not deliver for their citizens. But we find that exists in some subsectors, in some niches within those societies and in their government bureaucracy. The question is, how do we sort of grow that? And do we get the people who are leading those organizations on board with that logic, that are able to replicate the good things that are happening in the bureaucracies that are succeeding, whether it be in Ghana or Kenya or Mali or other places in the world. So public service is important. We need to sort of acknowledge that importance in the design of our civil service systems, in the design of our motivational systems, in the design of the way we train our leaders. We need to develop that further. We need to try to grow that in order to make our government institutions more responsive. One of the triggers for writing my book was a 2015 report of the United Nations Development Program. And UNDP, the UNDP report was public service motivation and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Are we in a crisis? And their concern was that in developing countries, we had not attempted to build a strong public service ethic. We had not attempted to develop strong public service motivation. And that was an essential ingredient for the government institutions being responsive to the aspirations associated with the Sustainable Development Goals. To me, that was a revelation. But the people in UNDP recognized that we needed to grow bureaucracies, we needed to grow cadres of civil servants who were responding to the ultimate needs of their citizens. And without doing that, we weren't going to achieve these grand aspirations that are embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals. So, it's Herbert Simon talked about the sciences of the artificial, and management is in part the science of the artificial. So we need to we need to accept that, and we need to try to grow public service in ways that pay off for the citizens who are dependent on the production and on the performance of the bureaucracies in the societies in which they live. We got some hands up here, I see.
We do. We have some hands. So first up in our queue is Jennifer Dudley, who is a PhD student in sociology at the University of Notre Dame. Jennifer, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. And I'm wondering, should we be concerned about like an individual level drift in what it means to be a good public servant? For instance, if a person takes on a job in the government with this idea about, I'm going to help people, I'm going to better their lives, and over time, they think they're still doing that. They think they're still achieving that, but their definition of achieving that has changed, and maybe to something that from an external viewpoint, we wouldn't consider them doing it as effectively.
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but let me give you some simple answers. Yes, I think we need to be concerned about drift, but let me refer you to an article that appeared in Governance by Elise Barufka and me, and it's a 2020 article on the evolution of motivation in public service. And we started with the Weberian model, and Weberian model worked well for us for about 100 years. Then we moved to something called New Public Management, which was trying to incentivize everything. And it was agentification, it was high-powered incentives, and I won't go into that in depth here. And that failed. It failed miserably, in part because the people that came along with new public management said, "Hey, don't be public service oriented. Don't be pro-social. We got something better. We want you to jump through the hoops because of the money we're going to give you." And so there's a drift there. There's a drift in the incentives the organization is providing. And it's going from appealing to their pro-social instincts, to their public service, to appeal to a set of extrinsic rewards that are simply trying to control the individual, rather than using that which has been internalized by the individual, that's much more interested in public service and the doing good. My sense is, though, and I look back, for instance, on the latter part of the Trump administration, where we had conversations about drift. And for instance, our State Department was decimated because people came to work for the State Department because of their belief that we had an obligation globally and that our interests were served by working with people around the globe. And the Trump administration came in and said, "We're not going to appoint people to these positions. We're going to fire the people. We're going to get rid of the people who did good." So the people, for instance, who came forward to talk about their concern that what we were doing in the Ukraine was to manipulate, to use our sort of relationship with the Ukrainian government to undo a political candidate, had nothing to do with why they came to the State Department. My point is that we need to be concerned sometimes with our political leadership and the drift that, and Bolsonaro in Brazil and Trump in the US, and we have other countries where that's happened. So we do have drift. But what we found in the State Department is the State Department was decimated because we had large sectors of their workforce leave because they said, "This is not what I signed on for." So many people who are interested in public service will walk away from that opportunity to do public service because the venue in which they were doing it has changed. And I lost Jennifer's picture here, but I hope my point is clear. Yeah, that we need to be concerned, but I think we need to up the game in terms of public service and say, we don't want you to be interested in public service. We want you to be interested in money. Let's face it, money is not why people come to government. If I wanted to make a lot of money in my life, I'd be looking to go to Wall Street. But I didn't look to go to Wall Street. I went to look to go to the university and do public service. I've developed a pretty good life, but I don't have big bank account, and that's not what public service is going to be about in most countries. Even though we tend not to be as attentive as we should to the amount of money we pay our public servants, because in some countries we may be overpaying. Luis has a question.
Yes, Luis is also a doctoral student in the Department of Sociology. He nodded quite vigorously when you mentioned Bolsonaro because he is both from Brazil and also because he is doing his dissertation research there. Luis, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thanks, Professor Perry. That was a really interesting talk. And my question builds a little bit about the first question about whether public service motivation is something durable, something that changes over time. So I noticed you talked a lot about the consequences of public service motivation, right, to improve performance, innovation, ethical behavior. But I was also wondering if you could talk a little bit about the factors that lead to public service motivation in the first place. So there's some research on organizational culture. There's some research on embeddedness as well, to what extent bureaucrats are embedded or not in local communities. That's something that Professor McDonald and I have been working on recently to try to understand, for example, the conditions under which bureaucrats' embeddedness in their local communities can lead to renewed public service motivation. Because some research shows that it can lead to capture, right? When bureaucrats develop ties to local communities, sometimes they might develop motivations to defend particular actors. At other times, they might develop motivations to defend the public interest. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like the causes of public service motivation in the first place, and in particular about the role of bureaucrats and embeddedness with the local communities that they're situated in.
Okay, I think you want to go to my website, the website on that last slide, download those 500 or 600 or 700 items on there in a Word file and search. One appropriate way to search would be to search for antecedents. Now, I've done 2 articles in the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, one in 1997 on the antecedents of public service motivation, where we talk sort of about professional socialization, parental socialization, religion, and other factors. Those I think are all important. I also did a 2000 article on bringing, I think part of the title is Bringing Society In, which is sort of saying, that we don't just sort of discover public service motivation. It's sort of, if you look even at self-determination theory in the higher end, the identification and internalization motivations, it's where people sort of say, these are the values of society, and I've bought into them. I've internalized them. So there is a social dimension to this, but there's a fairly large literature on antecedents. There's also large literature that looks at, for instance, are people in public service more likely to volunteer? Are they more likely to give philanthropically and a variety of other things? So there's a pretty substantial literature that would help to answer that. Although certainly more would be good. And if you're going to do your dissertation on this, let me say that in October, I gave the keynote for the Public Servant Day, Public Servant Month to the ENAP, which is the National Academy for Public Administration in Brazil. And last month, I gave a presentation at INSPIR in Sao Paulo when they were all sort of suffering. Sao Paulo is sort of really the eye of the storm in terms of COVID, and I think in Brazil. So, and they're translating the book. Is supposed to be translated into Portuguese, because I've been working with Republica, which is you may be familiar with it, which is a well-known nonprofit in Brazil that's interested, and I do actually cite them in the book, refer to them, and Eloy Oliveira has been very helpful to me, and he's coming to the US to study for a PhD next year, but at least I hope he is. But so there really is a pretty deep literature that connects public service motivation and its development. But it could be stronger, certainly, and higher quality, but there's a lot of evidence, I think, that helps to illuminate the questions that you were interested in. And one of the things I looked at was that one of my colleagues was for many years was the Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, and Elinor has the institutional analysis and development, and I've served on a number of doctoral committees with she and her and students she guided. But I've sort of reached back and tried to bring in the institutional analysis perspective. The article I refer to in Governance is an institutional analysis over time of what's happening in motivation, the evolution of motivation in public service. So I would sort of go to that research and try to tap into that. But email me if I can help you on that, because I think that's an important area. And if you can sort of uncover some magic bullets, we'd love to see them, because we need to sort of develop those magic bullets and put them in the guns, or maybe better, the quivers of arrows in the developing world.
So Jim, we had a question submitted via the chat by one of the master's students in sociology. Cheng, do you want to ask your question yourself?
Yes, sure. Thank you for the talk. Your great presentation just remind me our argument in cultural sociology, because some cultural sociologists argue that it is not the values and beliefs determine people's behaviors and choices. Rather, people can have conflicted values toward the same thing, and they will choose different values according to their needs at different times. So do you think this argument relates to your research, and how would public service motivation research respond to such kind of basic challenge?
Okay, I'm not sure. Are you from China?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the interesting things, as I have a good friend, and I was supposed to be lecturing last year in Shanghai, but there have been almost about 50 studies on public service motivation done in China. And Liu Bangcheng, or Bangcheng Liu, who has the same family name you do, is a scholar at Shanghai Jiatong. And he's done a number of high quality studies, and we've also co-authored some pieces. I'm not sure I entirely understand your question, but one of the arguments I've made is that public service motivation, and this to some extent I turn to research from March and Olson, which talks about the consequentiality or the logic of consequence versus the logic of, they don't call it identity, but you know, I think identity is important, an important consideration. We don't sort of jump from value to value. We sort of pursue our identities. You know, my identity, and since I'm talking to students at Notre Dame, I do practice my Catholicism, and sometimes I try to sort of step back, and when I get too wild about this, I have to say, is this the Catholic in me speaking, or is this the scholar in me speaking? But you know, I bring that identity to this research, and I also bring it to the way I think about the world. And I think you know, self-concept and identity, I think, is important, and we tend to act out the other sort of logic that March and Olson talk about is the logic of appropriateness. And I believe a lot of people who come to public service are motivated by identities that are much more deeply embedded, going back to Luis's question, more deeply embedded in the logic of appropriateness rather than the logic of consequence. And one reason why the logic of consequence doesn't work is because the people, for instance, in the public sector, we're trying to jump through hoops and trying to control, don't identify with the logic of consequence or high-powered incentives. They instead identify with things that are related, you know, to their doing good for their fellow citizens and to the cause with which they're associated, and to the values that they signed on to when they were young and maybe have pursued for many years. And so I don't know if that, let's go back to the questioner. And I don't see her face here, but does that begin to get at what you're?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so again, you know, values are important, but values, you know, we don't have the value of the day. And many years ago, I did, you know, research on commitment and job satisfaction. A person can be, you know, a person's job satisfaction can change from day to day. We can go into work and we can have an ugly encounter with our supervisor. We can be PO'd and go home and say, I hate the organization, I hate the place. Then the next day they go in and something good happens. Satisfaction can move from day to day. I don't see public service motivation as moving from day to day. Matter of fact, we have some research that suggests that public service motivation is the source of resilience in employees. That is, people may be engaged in work that's, you know, you take 2 steps back every time you take 1 step forward. My daughter, for instance, is a recovering alcoholic. She's also runs a recovery, or she used to run a recovery center. Now she's the vice president. But you know, she gets up in front of these folks, and you know, over the last 20 years, she's made a difference for thousands of people, even though she saw some of her clients, some of those people who had addictions, die. But, she can go into work one week and have somebody die, but the next week she'll meet two people who are in their fifth year of recovery. And her belief in sort of the longer term goal that is helping people put the addiction behind them and sort of achieve their human potential is what keeps her going. And I sort of associate that with a very specific type of public service motivation. But it's the type of public service motivation, or that public service motivation is what makes her resilient and what's kept her going on a high level to advance individual recovery, or the recovery of the people with whom she comes in contact with, even though there are setbacks daily and weekly. But she has to measure it by sort of the longer term goal, and also by the people who she's helped stay in recovery and achieve their human potential. And that's, I think, what it's ultimately all about. And to the extent that we have those sorts of goals and aspirations, public service motivation, in my view, can make a big difference, and it can lead to our resilience and also help us avoid the dark side, which is, get in the dumps and throw up our hands when things don't go well, because things will not go well and we will have setbacks. But as long as we sort of keep moving toward that larger aspiration, we're going to make a difference in the work we do.
That's a wonderful, wonderful question to end on. Teresa has told me that I have to be very disciplined about not keeping people past the hour. Jim, that was just a lovely way to, I think, sum up what's so powerful for me about your work and the work that it stimulated on public service motivation, that sense to which it can become this really powerful reservoir, like a perpetual motion machine or like solar energy for the soul, that sustains itself even as you exercise it, because the very performance of doing it is what feeds back into the willingness and the desire to do it again. And I think that also makes it a really tremendously powerful force for so many low-income countries, because they have many people who care deeply about each other and about the country and their communities, but they don't have lots and lots of resources to throw at problems. And so to help identify this area that offers such potential for treating with one of the most important challenges in states, which is like, how can we do effective work in the face of challenges, and to offer a glimmer of hope for that, I think is fantastic. For people who are interested in knowing more about like, how can we actually nurture and enhance public service motivation, will they find the answers in the pages of your book?
Definitely. Or they could email me, but read the book first, and then we can carry on a longer term conversation.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being so generous and sharing your thoughts and your decades of experience with us today. We really are glad to have you. And just because COVID kept you from campus does not mean that you cannot return when we reinstate normal business. Just like come down for a football game in the fall. And
well, wait, I have some bad news for you. IU is going to beat Notre Dame in 2030, and they're going to beat Notre Dame in 2031 because they're now on our schedule. So there's no escaping us. This is football.
It's on.
This is football. We assume we're going to beat you in basketball, but football too.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for coming and sharing your time with us today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.